All right, so in this first portion of the activity, you're going to set up and configure the 2D project. So when you do this, go ahead and go with your participants and open up the Unity Hub, or just open up the version of Unity that you're going to be using. In this case, I'm going to use the Unity Hub. So you can explain about the Unity Hub, the main features of it. So you can show your participants that they still have the Projects tab and the Learn tab. The new tab that's available is the Installs tab, and this allows participants to manage the different installs of Unity that they might have on their machine, or look up any of the official releases, and then also any of the beta releases that are currently out. So on our machine, we're going to be using the latest on this. So we'll use 2018.1 just to be safe on this. And we're going to go to Projects. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a brand new project. And you'll notice that this is very similar to what we've had before. We're going to add in a folder here. We're going to call it 2D Workshop Project. And then we're going to set our location and then what version of Unity we want to use. In our case, we're going to use 2018.1. Now, the template's going to be really important for us because we want to use the 2D template. The 2D template is going to set up Unity in such a way that it really benefits users who want to create 2D experiences. So if you accidentally choose a 3D experience, it's important to know that you can set up the template. And you could set those settings even if you choose the wrong template. But for us, we're going to keep from doing that, and we're going to get right into the 2D template. At this point, you'll want to go ahead and create the project. You'll wait for Unity to load up. Now, once Unity has loaded up, you can show your participants some of the differences between a 3D and 2D template. The main one that you'll notice is that the 2D button is activated and toggled, so that way you're working in just the 2D space here. And then there are some other things that happen in the background. So whenever we import textures, those textures are automatically imported as sprites instead of the default texture type. So what we're going to do now is we're going to import our assets. So let's select our scenes folder and actually delete it. Let's go to File and create a new scene first before we do that, because we don't want this sample scene to be loaded when we delete it. So I'm going to go to Scenes. I'm going to delete that folder, okay, just by hitting Delete on the keyboard. And then we're going to go to the Asset Store window, okay, and if you don't see that, you'll go to Window and then Asset Store. And I'm missing it here. There it is. Also, if you're using 2018.2, this is very possible that you would get that question. It would be under Window, and I believe General, and then Asset Store. Now, once the Asset Store is loaded, you'll simply type in the word training and hit Enter. And then you're going to go to the 2D Workshop Assets. Now, there are two different versions here. There is the 2D Workshop Game Development Assets Complete, which is this one. So you can see that in the tooltip there. We want to start with the Start Assets. So we're going to select that, and then you might have download. If you've never downloaded them before, your participants will probably have that. But then you're going to go ahead and just simply hit Import once that has downloaded, and it will bring up the import window. In this case, it's saying we're going to import a complete project. This is going to overwrite any current project settings, and we're going to say yes, go ahead and do that. So then we're going to import this. Once that has imported, you'll see a folder called Unity EDU, and then we just have a few folders here, okay? So this is exactly what we want. We're going to go back to our scene view, and now what we want to do is kind of talk about working with folders and renaming assets and things like that. So to create folders, we're going to go to the Unity EDU folder, and then in the project window, we're going to right-click, go to Create, and Folder. you'll want to create a scenes folder. And then inside of that, we're going to save all of our scenes. So let's go ahead and do that now. We're going to go to File, Save Scene As, and then inside of that new scenes folder we just created, we're going to call this Main. Okay. You could also tell your participants if they want to create an iterative save, they could do main_01 and then continue to save that way. That's totally up to them. I'm going to keep it as main and just overwrite that throughout this video. So now that we have created the folder and we've imported all of these assets, it's important to know that you can move assets around. It works just like files inside of your web browser or inside of your Windows browser, and let your participants know that all of the same rules apply. Don't stay on this too long. It's really not important. Most of the people really understand how to do this. So then we've saved our scene together, and let's go ahead and jump into the interface. So it's really important with the interface to keep things very simple for your participants. You just want to show them where things are, so that way as you're calling them out and saying things like, in the inspector, they know exactly where to go. So starting up at the top, you'll want to identify the menu bar. The menu bar is quite simply where most software packages, it's where most of the main tools are for most software packages. So things like File, Save As, opening projects, opening scenes. You can even create game objects and add components from the menu bar. But typically the menu bar, you're going to use it to get to different windows to show off different parts of the features. Okay. Then we'll move on to the toolbar. You'll explain that the toolbar is broken up into different parts. You have the tools themselves where you have move, rotate, and scale. You can change the pivot of the gizmos of those move, rotate, and scale tools. You have the playback buttons, which allow you to play right inside of the editor. And then you have the services section, and that's things like Collaborate, Cloud, and even managing your account. And then you have layers and the layout button. The layout button is going to be important for us because we are going to save out a custom layout. But remind your participants that we will look at that here in just a moment. You could go ahead and click on this layout button and choose default, so that way your participants have the exact same window as you do and it looks familiar. Then you'll move on to the hierarchy and just explain that the hierarchy, its purpose is to show us a list of all of the game objects that are currently in our scene. And then we could even select game objects from the hierarchy. And then we also have the ability to parent or nest game objects inside of the hierarchy. So whenever we select a game object and we move it or reorganize it in the list, we could drop it onto another object and that actually parents it. Now we'll talk about how that's done a little bit later. Then we have the scene view, and just simply explain that the scene view is the main window into the project. And so we're going to be moving around in this, and we'll talk about navigation soon. After the scene view, there's the game view. And just simply explain that the game view shows us exactly what our main camera sees inside of our scene. So this is what the end user will see whenever they play the game. There's the asset store. We're not going to go over that. I typically just leave that alone. Move over to the inspector. You'll want to tell participants that the inspector is context sensitive. And so what that means is it will only show us information about the selected objects. So if we select that main camera, you'll see that we now have a transform component, a camera component, a flare layer, and an audio listener. This might be a good opportunity to tell your participants about game objects. That a game object is simply it's an empty game object thing. It doesn't have anything on it except for a transform component. And then whenever you add components to them, that's what changes the behavior of a game object. In this case, the only reason that this camera is a camera is because it has a camera component applied to it. So any other game object that we create, like an empty game object, you can right-click and show them how to create an empty game object. This game object, notice, only has a transform component, but you can add components to create a different behavior. So don't go into that, don't go creating components. Just make sure that your participants understand what a game object is and that components change the behavior of them. Let's select that game object in our hierarchy, and we're going to simply hit delete to remove that. Then you'll move on to the project window, and the project window is quite simply where all of our source assets are held. It's important to discuss in this workshop that the source assets control all of the assets that are in all scenes. So for example, if you have a sprite in all of your scenes and you change something about it in the source folder or the source file or in the project window, remind participants that it will change that particular asset in all of the scenes. So you'll want to remind your participants that they need to be absolutely sure of what they're changing in the project window. And so as you work through this, remind your participants which asset you're working on, whether it be the asset that is in the scene or the asset in the project window. And then be sure to explain to your participants that if you're changing something in the project window, make sure you explain to them why you're changing that every time. So that way they understand the context in which they should make changes to assets in the project window. Okay, so now that we have that, you would want to also show off the console window. Let them know that the console window is really important because it allows us to see any problems that are happening in our project. It will show us warnings and errors, and if we have any errors, we will need to take care of those before the game can actually run. So now that you've gone through the entire interface, now it's a good idea to go in and start navigating the interface. So currently with our project, we want to make sure that we are in 2D mode here. Okay. And then you'll want to kind of go through the process of actually moving around in screen space. So remind participants that they can pan in the scene view by holding down the middle mouse button. Okay. And then they can zoom in and out using the scroll wheel, moving forward and backward. They also have the ability to hold down Alt and then the right mouse key or mouse button and zoom in and out that way. This is typically all you need whenever you're working on 2D projects. Then you'll want to show your participants the Move, Rotate, and Scale tool. Remind participants that they have keyboard shortcuts that they can use, and they are W, E, and R, and show them how it is changing between the three tools as they do that. So we'll start off with the Move tool by hitting W, and we're going to select our main camera. And when we have the Move tool selected and the object selected, you'll notice that there's the Move tool. Remind participants that they can move along a single axis, but then they also have the ability to move along both axes using the square in the middle, and that's a coplanar movement. Then, after you've moved the object, you'll want to show participants how to rotate objects. So you'll use the E key to rotate and show them that they can rotate along these different axes. And if they rotate it to a very odd position, that's okay. We're going to talk about resetting here pretty soon. And then you could also show off scaling. With scaling, it's going to be kind of hard with this game object, the camera. Remind participants that this won't actually show any sort of scaling, but they will be able to see this scale value update in the transform component. So they can scale in the Y, the Z, and the X, or if they want to scale in all three directions at the same time, they could scale along this middle box, and it does change those all at the same time. So now that they understand how to use that, we will talk about the Rect Transform tool whenever we start working with our sprites. Okay? Typically, whenever we are working with sprites or 2D projects, the Rect Transform tool is the main one that we will use to move, to rotate, and to scale our game objects. So now let's reset our transform component of our game object. Let's select our camera, and we're going to click on the cog wheel, and you'll notice that we have reset position, reset rotation, and reset scale. We can go ahead and do that, or you could reset all of them at the same time, Or what you could do is actually type in the values. Okay, so if we wanted to reset our position back to 0, 0, 0, we would simply type that in. Now, the main camera itself needs to be 0, 0, and -10. That's its default location. So if we hit reset position, it would actually reset it to 0, 0, and 0, but we don't want that. So we're going to type in 0, 0 on the Y and leave it at -10 on the Z. Then we can actually click on that cogwheel and reset the rotation, and then do the same thing and reset the scale. So now we're back to that original position. Now that you understand how to navigate inside of the editor, another thing that's going to be really important is whenever we're panning around, we could get lost. And so something that participants can do is select the game object that they know they want to focus in on, select it in the hierarchy, and then hover the mouse over the scene view. This is a crucial step, so remind your participants that it's really important that they have the mouse over the scene view. Then they're going to press the F key, and the F key will frame in or focus on the currently selected game object. And they can find themselves a little bit easier in the editor. So then, after we have you've done that, allow your participants to play around with it a little bit. Give your participants the opportunity to bring in this splash screen game object into the scene. Now, you'll notice here that it's not allowing me to drag and drop that in. And the reason for that is because the texture type did not change to the sprite. And so we're trying to drag this in. It doesn't recognize that as a game object. So this is going to lead us into the next part where we're going to talk about actually using sprites and all of that. So what participants can do if they want to practice moving, rotating, and scaling is they can actually bring in or create game objects. So they can create some 2D game objects like a sprite, or let's just do a sprite here. So on this new sprite, it doesn't show us anything in the sprite itself, so we'll click on that. Just have them use the first background sprite there. And then with that selected, we're going to focus in on that, and it's really small, but you can show your participants how they can use move on that. But I would actually ask the participants to get used to using the rect tool. So they can left click on the middle and move that. They can hover over the corners and rotate. And then they can actually hover directly over the corners themselves and scale that way. They can also hold shift to constrain the scaling. And then if they hold down alt while holding shift, that allows them to scale directly from the middle. Okay. So allow your participants to practice that. Then we're going to get into actually working with our assets here, and we'll do that in our next video.